All right, hello everybody again. This is the next part of lesson number 3. And what we're going to now talk about is the absorption of the fatty acids, monoglycerides, and cholesterol from the lumen of the small intestine into the blood. And as a review, what we're talking about is, again, this is where the absorption occurred. Excuse me, this is where the digestion occurred. And now we're going to talk about here, how does it get across into the blood? Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about now. And that's what this slide depicts. Okay, so again, what we have is we have the lumen of the small intestine, we have the wall of the small intestine, and then we actually have the lacteal of the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system, before we go on to this any further, is the lymphatic system, think of it as a highway system throughout the body, delivering, it helps with the immune system, helps deliver the immune response throughout the body. And you can see the green lines, again, are the vessels of the lymphatic system. And you may find that you have these lymph nodes. You see some lymph nodes in the neck. If you've ever gone to the doctor and if you've been sick and they feel underneath your throat, that they're trying to feel to see if your lymph nodes are swollen. And usually if they're swollen, that's an indication there's some infection nearby. And so what you'll see here is that before that we're talking about is how the monoglycerides and fatty acids have made their way into the lymphatic system before they make it into the bloodstream. Okay, so let's first talk about how it makes its way here into through the wall of the small intestine. Here we have the again, we have the fatty acids and the monoglycerides and the cholesterol. They're here in the lumen. And what they've done is they're going to be taken up, they're going to be absorbed into the epithelial cell of the wall of the small intestine via diffusion. So it's basically able to enter freely. And then what happens is they make their way into the endoplasmic reticulum. And inside the endoplasmic reticulum, what happens is they're going to be recombined. The fatty acids and the monoglycerides are going to be recombined to reform a triglyceride. So what we've done is, in the lumen of the small intestine, is we've broken apart the triglyceride into fatty acids and monoglycerides. They've been absorbed into this wall of the small intestine, gone back into the endoplasmic reticulum, only then to be remade. The triglyceride is now remade. So you break down the triglyceride in the lumen into fatty acids and monoglycerides. They absorb into the wall of the small intestine, go to the endoplasmic reticulum, where now it's put back, the triglyceride is put back together. And the reason for that is that the triglyceride is too large to make its way into the wall of the small intestine by itself. So it has to be broken into pieces before, so it can get into the wall, only to be put back together. Well, once you have a triglyceride in the endoplasmic reticulum, it gets moved into the Golgi apparatus. And there what happens is a protein coat, represented by the purple, is going to be wrapped around the triglyceride. And at this point, what you've now has formed is what's called a chylomicron. And the chylomicron is going to be very important because it is the lipoprotein that contains the triglycerides from the food that we eat. Okay, that's going to be very important. So remember that. Chylomicrons contain triglycerides from the food that we eat. Because in a little bit, we're going to talk about something else that contains triglycerides that happen in between meals. But right now, right after a meal, chylomicrons are the lipoprotein that contains triglycerides from the food that we've eaten. And what happens is these chylomicrons then will make their way down to the basal membrane, the outside membrane of the small intestine, and then through a process called exocytosis. In other words, that's a fancy word that just means the triglycerides are released into the lacteal of the lymphatic system. And think of a lacteal as if, for example, my arm here was a lymphatic system, the channel here, these lacteals are just basically the offshoots or the smaller offshoots of the lymphatic system. And then what happens is, in this particular case, the chylomicron is taken up by the lacteal, and then it'll be taken up into the rest of the lymphatic system. Okay, so this is the absorption of the fatty acids and monoglycerides through the wall of the small intestine into the lymphatic system. Okay, where does it go from here? Well, what ends up happening is it travels throughout the body, throughout the lymphatic system, until it gets to this portion in the lymphatic system called the thoracic duct. And the thoracic duct is the point at which the lymphatic system meets the cardiovascular or the blood vessels depicted here in the color blue. So again, the thoracic duct, here is the lymphatic system, and here is the blood vessels. Okay, so it's the point at which, the thoracic duct is the point at which the lymphatic system meets the blood vessels, the circulatory system. And that is how we've taken now the food that we've eaten, and it's been able to then make its way, the triglycerides have made their way into our bloodstream. So the question is where does the triglyceride or the chylomicron containing the triglyceride go from here? So again, just a review of how fat moves from the intestines to the tissues and organs. Here we have, again, the intestinal tract. Here's the lacteal containing the chylomicrons. It moves, the chylomicrons moves through the thoracic duct into the into the bloodstream, into the circulatory system, and then it's going to circulate. So the chylomicron is going to circulate. Well, it's going to circulate and it's going to make its way into the capillaries of the various tissues of the body, into the skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, adipose tissue cells, and the liver cells. So what ends up happening is that in the skeletal muscle, those chylomicrons are going to be used to deliver triglycerides to help with energy. Same thing with cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is going to use those triglycerides for energy. Whereas in adipose tissue, those triglycerides are going to be stored for later use. And in the liver cell, which is going to be the most, where we're going to focus most of our attention, that's when we're going to talk about the production of the other lipoproteins that we think of, that we thought of before. So our main focus is going to be what's happening here at the liver. But again, the triglycerides in the form stored here are traveling in the chylomicrons. The idea is that it delivers much needed triglycerides to the skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle for energy. It gets broken down via beta oxidation. If you remember exercise physiology or your anatomy and physiology, those triglycerides are broken down to form ATP to be used for muscle contraction. Again, there might be situations where those chylomicrons, those triglycerides are not needed, and they get stored in the adipose tissue. But again, there are cases, a large part of those chylomicrons will end up in the liver. And that's when, in between meals, where the other lipoproteins are formed. Well, what are chylomicrons again? Just to review, chylomicrons enter the bloodstream through the thoracic duct, and they travel to either adipose tissue or the liver or the skeletal muscle, the heart muscle that we talked about. So the chylomicrons are made up basically about 90% of triglycerides, phospholipids about 5%, which make up the cell membrane. And then you have cholesterols about 4% and some proteins. The key though here, so it's about 99% basic lipids. The key is though they transport dietary lipids in the form of triglycerides from the intestines, small intestines, to the other locations in the body. That's the key, being dietary lipids. And then again, they travel either to the adipose tissue where it's stored for later use, or it travels to the liver, and the chylomicrons then are used in between meals to make other lipoproteins, which we'll get to in just a minute. However, before we go any further, it's going to be important that we back up and that you have a good understanding of what's happening here in with the absorption of the monoglyceride and fatty acids. Okay, so at this point, take a moment, write in your own words the steps, replay the video, making sure that you have a good understanding of what is happening with the absorption of those monoglycerides and fatty acids in the formation of triglycerides, and how it's made that those triglycerides in the form stored in or traveling in chylomicrons makes their way into the bloodstream. Okay, so take a moment, write these steps in your own words, make sure that you understand before we move any further.